Hi everyone, welcome to another installment of GoTo's live Ask Me Anything sessions. My name is Adele. I'm a software developer at Trifork Amsterdam. We have a really interesting session today about all things retrospectives with experienced facilitator and author, Dr. Aino Corry. Hi Aino, thanks for joining us today.
Hi Adele, thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Aino will be speaking at GoTo Amsterdam 2021, which is scheduled for December 6th to 9th. Still some time to go, but in this case, it's definitely worth the wait. But if you really can't wait, there is a virtual masterclass lined up on June 15th, which means you don't need to be in Amsterdam and you don't need to be in the freezing cold to attend. So check out the website gotoacademy.nl to learn more and to secure your spot. So no doubt we will cover a lot of ground today. So let's kick things off with a couple of polls so that Aino and I can help you get the most out of the session. So to respond to the polls, you can click on the links in the chat on YouTube or Twitter or wherever you're watching us from. So the first question is, what is your level of experience with retrospectives? And the second question is, what is your biggest challenge with retrospective? So I believe the first one is multiple choice and the second one is a free form. So please just don't be shy. Let us know your thoughts. This is just like a retrospective itself. There are no wrong answers. Please just be yourself. So while you're busy with that, I will go over today's schedules. The plan is we will start with the pre-submitted questions. We got a couple today, so that's really great. And we'll pick up some live questions as we go. So if you didn't get a chance to submit a question beforehand, it's really not too late. You can type it in the box there on the live stream after you fill out these responses. So do we have some responses so far? Yes. Sorry, my screen's a bit smaller than yours. So people, we've got 60% for facilitated many for one team and 40% saying facilitated for many teams. So we've got a few facilitators here. And we haven't built our word cloud just yet for the biggest challenge. But I can rely on my colleague to keep an eye on that one. And if something interesting comes up, we can shift back to that screen. So while this gives you a little bit more of a chance to keep your answers coming in, I will just start, I know, with the classic interview question with a little bit of a twist maybe. So tell us about yourself, and particularly as a woman in tech, I'm really interested in your journey into computer science as a woman.
Yes. Right. A little bit about myself. I just turned 50, so there's so many things to say. But I'll start with my journey into tech. I was always very interested in mathematics, and I thought that the way that it was taught in primary and secondary school was not very good. So I wanted to be a maths teacher. And then I decided later that I actually don't want to be a teacher in primary and secondary school because I think it's a really hard job to do. So I thought I would be a high school teacher in mathematics. But then while I was at university studying to become a high school teacher in mathematics, I had to take some programming lessons, and I'd never programmed before. So I didn't want to do it, but I was about to fail my first class in programming. So some of my co-students took me down into the basement where there was a computer, and they taught me how to program. And that was an amazing experience. It was just wonderful to program. It was so satisfying. It was so much fun. I could make the computer do whatever I wanted it to do. I really liked it. So I became really fascinated with programming, and along the years, I majored in computer science instead of mathematics. And so that was sort of how I got into tech. by chance, like most things in my life. And then when I finished my master's thesis, it was about design patterns and how to use design patterns in industry, but it was in the 90s and nobody used design patterns in industry. And I thought, if I go out now, I won't have the chance to work with design patterns. So I decided to do a PhD instead of going out into the real life. So I did a PhD where I focused on design patterns and the development of object-oriented programming language and a semi-automated documentation of Java programs with design patterns. So that was my PhD thesis. And then I went out in industry with a company in Denmark called Trifork that you might have heard of in 2001. And I worked there for a few years, and then I went back as a researcher at university, and then I came back to Trifork again, and then I came back to university again, and then I thought about quitting university and going back to Trifork, but then I decided, nah, I'm going to do both. So I started my own company, Meta Developer, and I'm now a consultant for Trifork, and I still teach at the university, but now I'm teaching the teachers how to teach computer science. So I'm a very meta developer.
Yeah, I was going to say Meta, and that kind of makes sense because I was looking at your website earlier today and it's called Meta Developer, so that makes perfect sense. So let's move on to our first pre-submitted question. I imagine this is one that maybe comes up a lot. So Lars would like to know, I have a big team of 13 people. How can I facilitate all to be heard and to be talking? Of course, it's the usual suspects who talk. I'm usually in that category, sorry. The retros then end up taking a long time and we lose focus when there are that many people. So how can I shorten and keep the value and keep the focus in these retrospectives?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as you say, it's something that happens often. I have to first put in a warning here. 13 people in a retrospective. You have to think about how many minutes there is for actually talking for all of them. So if you tend to have a very short retrospective, like 60 minutes for 13 people, then there are not that many minutes for people to talk at all. And maybe you should reconsider having them say anything at all. Maybe it's just silent writing. But that being said, if you're not allowed to spend more time on the retrospective, but if you can have fewer people, let's look at the problem with some people being loudmouths and some people being silent ones. So if you're in a situation where you notice that some people are loudmouths or some people are silent ones and you need to solve it right away, then you just have to solve the symptom that you see that some people are saying a lot and some people are saying very little. And in those cases, you can take away all the plenum discussion and instead send them out in breakout rooms, or perhaps have a lot more writing and putting some more writing on the other writing. So it could be just writing post-it notes, putting it on the document, or it could be the triple nickels from the Agile Retrospectives book where somebody writes something on a page and somebody else writes some more on that same page, so that we're writing together instead of talking together, because that might make it easier for people to all get a chance to share things. Trouble is that people are very different. And if you have a group of people where some are loudmouths and some are silent ones, it's better if you understand why they're loudmouths and why they're silent ones, because it could be that it's different kind of thinkers. So a reflective thinker needs to think about things alone in quiet before they start sharing things. So they need some time to think about questions. So if you have reflective thinkers on the team, if that's what you noticed, then every time you ask a question, don't just ask, what do you think about this? Say, take 10 to 20 seconds to think about this question and then feedback, because then they have time to think about it. If it's because you have some active thinkers, they need to talk through things in order to understand things, or do something in order to think. So you probably met these people who can't think without doing it out loud. And it's a problem if it's in a plenum session. So if you have these people who have to think out loud, then you can put them in smaller rooms, like in the breakout rooms. And when we're done with this COVID, you can put them together and speak 2 and 2. Now, if you have the chance to work with this team over a longer period, you can figure out that maybe some of them are not saying something because there's not enough trust in the team. Perhaps they are shy, perhaps they're scared to say something out loud. And if you find out that that is a problem by talking to them one-on-one between the retrospectives, then it's a good idea to try to work with the trust in the team. Just calling it out on a retrospective or on a team building session where you say that if we are to build trust in this team, then we need to know a little bit about each other. We need to laugh together. We need to learn how to communicate better, so that you know that if you want me to review that code, you ask me in this way instead of that way, because you ask me in this way, then I'll definitely do it. And when you review my code, you use, for instance, this template for reviewing, so that you don't just say this looks like shit or something like that. So there's so many levels in that, people talking a lot and people talking very little. And I think that it's crucial to figure out what it is that is causing this.
I think I just learned something about myself there, because I, volunteered that I am someone that tends to volunteer maybe a little bit too much. But yeah, I do find myself sort of saying things as I'm like I'm doing right now. I'm thinking it through as I say it out loud. So thanks. I actually really just got an insight into myself. So what we'll do is we'll just take a quick pause here and we'll go back to our poll question. I believe we've got some answers here to the freeform question. So biggest challenge with retrospectives is convincing teams to find value in the retrospective process when their organizational culture or leadership makes it hard, impossible for them to change in the way that they need to. Would you like to make a comment on that one, Aino?
Yeah, that sounds really bad.
We shouldn't laugh.
I could elaborate a bit more. Maybe I should that. Thinking out loud again. So I think if you are in an organization where the leadership team does not allow the team to figure out how they want to work, you have a much bigger problem than a problem with finding the value in retrospectives. That being said, what I think is important in a retrospective is to actually focus on, okay, the things we're talking about. Is it things that we can actually change? Is it things that we can influence? Or is it things that are in the soup that we can't do anything about? I think that's valuable for all teams. But I think if we have a team where they're not allowed to change things, like change the way they have meetings, or change the way that they test, or change the way they answer pull requests. If they can't do these changes, then if they have that activity at the retrospective and everything is out in the soup, that's something you can take back to the leadership team, and you can say, well, look at this. What we find at the retrospective is that we should change these things. But if you don't allow us to change these things, then we can't work as best as we can. We can't be the best team that we want to be. And that means that we can't make the best software that we want to be making. And that means that you won't earn as much money. I mean, sometimes you have to be really focused on the money for the leadership teams, depending on the leadership team. Also, once facilitated a retrospective for a team where we came up with some action points, and then the manager came to me afterwards and asked me what the action points was, and I said, "Oh, we're going to change these things," and he just lost it. He just said, "They can't change these things. They can't just decide to stop doing this or that." I don't even remember what it was. I just remember his reaction. And I think that people like that needs to know that a team should be autonomous, at least to some extent. And if they want to work in a specific way, that is the way that they'll be most efficient in the long run. Otherwise, you'll lose the best people.
I think the first point there about people having trouble opening up to the team, I think you addressed that pretty well in the previous response, about that people might just be reflective thinkers. Do you have anything more to add about not having an attainable action because people have failed to open up, or haven't felt safe to open up, rather?
Yeah. So if you notice in your retrospectives that you facilitate, that all the action points that come up are, let's change the coffee in the canteen, or maybe the color of the napkins or something like that, and you have the sense that there's something that you don't work on, then perhaps you should try having gathering the data in an anonymous way. You can do that online in numerous ways, and see if that works. Of course, it would be better if you could just work with the team and create that trust together with the team so that they can open up. Again, that's something that I think should be done between the retrospectives and not at the retrospective. It's a bit like when you want to lose weight, you don't lose weight between Christmas and New Year's Eve, you lose weight between New Year's Eve and Christmas, right? don't try to change things in the difficult situations. Try to change things when it's calm. So if people are not opening up, it is probably a problem not just in the retrospectives, but in the whole corroboration they have. And that also means that it can be difficult for them to ask questions if there's something they can't do. It can be difficult for them to admit that there's something that they're stuck in. So I think that that's a big red light, that you have to do something about it. And there are so many ways of working with trust in an organization, and psychological safety, and how to be comfortable with uncomfortable situations together. But I think that's too big of a thing to take up right now.
Yeah, I think you've given some good pointers there, and it's really something you do need to find out in your own context. So someone says here that they like to have a new exercise for each retro, and it takes time, but that's also something that can be quite difficult to do. But then if you don't do it, it can get boring doing the same exercises. So would you have any sort of comments or ideas around that one?
Yeah, I used to say that when I started facilitating retrospectives, I thought that to be a good facilitator, you need to know a lot of activities and different types of retrospectives by heart, and that would make you a good facilitator. I think now that that's not actually the most important thing. The most important thing is how you listen and how you react and how you facilitate the conversation and how you facilitate endings and conversations in the retrospective. I appreciate that people sometimes need to change the way that they have retrospectives, but I think that if a team thinks they need to have something new at each retrospective, I think it's actually a symptom of something else. Perhaps it's a symptom that they don't think that the discussions that come out of the retrospective activities are valuable for them. So perhaps instead of having a new activity, perhaps you should try debriefing the activity a little bit more. So asking the team, what did you think I wanted you to get out of this, and what did you actually get out of this? So talking about the activities and talking about what worked for them and what didn't work for them. But now, if you really want new activities all the time, there are so many different ways online to get different activities. So it's almost open-ended, but I still think that you should consider that it might be a symptom of a different problem if they continue to want to have something new. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think there's a bit of a tendency to forget the oldies or the already done anyway. So I don't see why you can't have, it might not be every week that it's the same, but maybe you cycle them around every 3 months or so. I mean, that's a large enough cadence that you don't get bored. I mean, I like to cook, but I don't cook every recipe off the internet and then start again. I have sort of a nice rotation that I enjoy, and it gives me just enough in variety and nutrition to keep going.
Yeah.
So we had someone mention a curious manager in the questions just before they disappeared there. So so related to that, should you invite a product owner or a manager to a retro? Do you think the split interest to the business and the team makes it hard for the team to be truly honest and safe? But if you do it, are there any tips to make it better?
Yeah. So my rule of thumb is that the people who are attending the retrospective for the team is the team members and nobody else. Now, that being said, there can be some reasons for having the manager there. I have some teams where the manager is almost part of the team, like in startups, or if they have been a startup where they've been together so long that they trust each other that it's not a problem to have the manager there. In those cases, though, it's sometimes difficult because if new people enter the team, they might not feel that they really can trust the manager in the same way. So they might not share as much as the other team members because there is the manager there. On the other hand, I think also that sometimes it can be valuable to invite the manager to a retrospective from time to time. The activity that I mentioned before with the soup exercise where the team puts in, okay, so these are the problems that we can do something about. These are the problems we can have influence on, and these are the problems where we can't do anything about. If you tend to have the same things out in the soup that you can't do anything about, I think it's valuable to consider with the team, should we invite maybe the manager next time? Should we invite a representative from another team? Should we invite somebody from one of the other groups that we're working with? And with the product owner, I think actually that having the product owner in the retrospective is valuable for a lot of different teams. I don't mind the focus on the business. I think it's actually important to have this as part of the team. But again, it depends on how they feel about the product owner. So in one way, I want them to feel as calm and as safe as possible in the retrospective, and I don't want to jinx that. On the other hand, I also want them to have a very good cooperation with the product owner, because it's a crucial part of the teamwork. So it's sort of it's a very good "it depends" answer, but I think it depends very much on what you want to achieve. And whenever you have these questions, should we invite the product owner? Should we invite the manager? Ask yourself, why do you want to do that? What value will it give us? And what can it take away from us? What's the risk?
Yeah, really good food for thought there. Sort of related to maybe bringing in people outside the scope of the team when appropriate. Fei-Yin Wang would like to know, how should a UX designer communicate with a programmer and vice versa, so that they can understand each other?
So that's a very good question. And I think it comes down to basic communication, not just related to retrospectives, but of course this is a problem in retrospectives sometimes, that a team which is put together of all different kinds of people should work together. And the retrospective, since it's one of the more team building activities in the team, it's important that people can talk to each other. So in my experience, when it comes to UX designers and programmers, I think the important part is to figure out, what do you understand already? Where should I start talking? So it's a bit like when you're teaching. When you're teaching, you have to think about what is in that other person's head that I can build upon before I start saying something. So you have to try and imagine, for instance, the programmer. What does the programmer know about UX? So perhaps coming up with an example, or asking the programmer to come up with an example. So for instance, there could be this thing about, oh, as a UX designer, I want to be in on the very early discussions about the development, and the programmer will say, actually, you don't need to be there until the very end. And this is the time where the UX designer maybe have to show the programmer some examples of UX designs gone very well and some UX designs gone very wrong. And there's multitudes of that just looking in your phone's apps, right? So there's so many examples of UX gone well and UX gone wrong. And in these cases where the UX is going wrong, I think that a UX designer is able to explain to a programmer that this is actually something that goes all the way down into the code, all the way down into what data you can fetch and how fast you can fetch them, and what the security is building into the architecture. So I think examples is the way forward. And the other way around, I think that for a UX designer to understand what the programmer is doing and what the problems are with the program, I think the programmers have to be open about how long time does it actually take for them to implement these different things. I see that sometimes at demo sessions with the business, with the stakeholders and the users, where the stakeholder has asked for a story where you put in a name here, and then in this side of the application, the name pops up again. And of course, people who don't program sometimes will think, well, it's obvious that this is a very easy task. I put in a name here and it pops up here. It couldn't be any easier than that. And then if they hear the programmer actually explain, okay, yes, but then it has to go down here, and it has to go through some crazy GDPR process, and then it has to go into this database, and it has to go through this layer, this security, and then we have to attach these different pieces of the data to these different pieces of the front end. So I think understanding is very important, and examples is very important, and just sort of explaining how clever I am and how important it is that I'm doing is not really helpful. But trying to meet each other at the levels of understanding, I think, is crucial. And also in retrospectives, I often see that we have maybe 5 developers, and then we have 2 UI UX people, and whenever they dot vote for actions to have, it turns out that the developer things always win, of course, because it's a democracy. So I think if you have those settings in your teams, it's also important to think about, how is it actually that we are deciding on things here? Is democracy really the right thing to do? Because as we've seen with democracy in the last elections in the world, some people can get really angry as the minority if they don't get what they want.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm actually really thinking about what you just said, and I guess the word that just screams to me in lights is empathy. It's just really being able to put yourself in that other person's position and being open to listen to their ideas without judgment. So I think you've hinted at this a little bit, but I'd actually would like to dig a little deeper. This one is from Natalie, and she would like to know, how do you make sure that everyone feels comfortable giving open and honest feedback?
Yeah. So again, I think you have to think about the why. Why is it that some people feel uncomfortable giving open and honest feedback? That's because they've been trained to people reacting very harshly to the feedback. And maybe it could also be that they've not been trained to give feedback in a way that is pleasant and empathetic. Oh, those English words.
Empathic, but I only learned that 2 weeks ago. I would say empathetic, but then it's got pathetic in it, which it's absolutely not. So let's just go with empathic.
Empathic, yeah. And so I think that if there's a problem with feedback, you have to look at the people giving the feedback. Do they know how to give the feedback? And the people receiving the feedback, are they in the right mindset to receive the feedback? And when giving the feedback, we talk about the pedagogical sandwich, that it's always a good idea to say something nice before you say something that's a bit critical, and then say something nice again. I think it's important to be empathic to the problems that people have. And I think the Prime Directive that Norm Kurth wrote for Project Retrospectives is really important here. The Prime Directive is that remember and truly believe that everybody did the best they could at all times, given what they knew, what skills they had at hand, and stuff like that. And I think that is really important to remember, both when you're giving feedback, but also when you're receiving feedback, that, okay, that didn't work as planned, but I did my very best. I know I did my best. So the only way I can do better is to accept that this was not what I should have done, and then do it differently the next time. But the thing about feedback is really difficult for people, because people receive and give feedback in so many different ways. So I think maybe if there is a problem in the team, that's something that they should have a specific retrospective about, where they come up with examples of where the feedback went well and the feedback didn't go so well, and perhaps thinking about the template for feedbacks. For instance, as I mentioned before, it could be a template for the code review, it could be a template for asking for advice about an architecture that you wrote up or something like that, so that people follow the template, and then you know that you're actually getting some constructive feedback on that. But then again, I think that people get very tense, both when they get feedback, but also right before they get feedback, because they're already worried about the feedback. So I think that tension in the room is a problem, because when there's already a tension, you tend to listen to things, you tend to filter things, you tend to see them in a more negative light. But if you can make people less tense, for instance, by making them laugh before we go to the feedback session, it's much easier for them to open their minds and take in things. And also, if people laugh together, they can work together, is my experience. When they can laugh together, they can get rid of a lot of this tension. Not laugh at each other, but laugh with each other. And as a facilitator, you can do crazy stuff so that they laugh at you. And I know John LeDrew is listening, and he's a master in doing crazy stuff, and he doesn't mind people laughing at him. And I think that's such a brilliant ability and skill set to have as a facilitator.
Absolutely. I think there's an element of culture, both within the nation, the company, and the team itself. And for example, I'm an Australian, I work in the Netherlands, and I'm very free with my positive feedback, otherwise known as a compliment. And I think the Danes are similar as well, that they just don't know what to do with that information, and they go shy, or they don't know what to say. So in those kinds of environments where you might have different cultures together, it pays to actually sort of agree on a team culture and the rules of engagement. So those things are taken with less adversarial ears.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. And it's it's a good point that you're saying. It goes both for positive and negative feedback. I remember when I started going to the States, where people are much more complimenting in the open than they are in Denmark, they would say nice things about my clothes, and I would say, oh, but it was very cheap and it's very old, and it's actually it's ruined down here. You can see there's a ruin, and they'll be, oh, nice glasses, yeah, but I need new ones. I'm not really, trying to cut them down instead of just saying thank you. So
yeah,
there's a lot of culture in it, definitely.
So since we've sort of spoken about John a little bit, he seems to appreciate your comment about, being willing to be laughed at if it gets the group moving forward. And also relating to our point about culture a little, he asks, are there any specific challenges when facilitating very diverse teams versus more homogeneous teams?
Yeah, definitely. There's numerous challenges in both directions. So as I said before, with the voting, with the democratic voting, that can be difficult if it's not a homogenic group, because if there's a part of the group that's homogenic and there's other ones that are sort of on the side, then the democratic vote is not a very good idea. On the other hand, if it's a very homogenic group, it can sometimes be difficult to get a good discussion where you're generating insights about what happened, because they all think in the same way and they've all experienced the things in the same way. So there's not a lot of a spark to the communication often. And in those cases, a more diverse group can be much more creative in figuring out what's actually causing these problems, but also much more creative in figuring out what experiment should we try to get rid of these problems, or to actually make the good things even better, because that's also part of a retrospective, that we're celebrating the things that were good and try to get more of the things that are good. So there's definitely good and bad things about having a diverse team and a homogeneous team. But I think diverse teams are much more interesting and much more creative to work with in a retrospective, even though they might be harder.
Yeah, it's you kind of need that friction to generate the best ideas. So on the theme of compliments and making people uncomfortable, John would also just like to say that he loves the artwork that you have behind you of a whale swimming through the forest.
Thank you. It's really not supposed to be there. It's an intermediary place. It's because I'm looking, when I'm looking at my camera, I'm looking at a white wall, and that doesn't feel very well. So I thought I would buy something which I think would be interesting to look at. There's a lot of details, and I really like looking at that whale. So it's supposed to be behind the camera, so that when I have a meeting with people and I'm giving them very good eye contact, I'm actually staring at my whale, but they don't know that.
That's a good tip, but now it's out in the open. So we mentioned good humor. I think both of us have a good sense of humor, which leads me to answer Sandra's question with a very selfish yes. And Sandra's question is, do you think a good sense of humor correlates with giftedness and high talent?
Well, I've done some research in humor and laughter, and it does actually tend to correlate. Because if you have a good sense of humor, what you can do is that you can associate very quickly the things that you hear to other things, and you can come up with new views on things, so that you suddenly say something which is a little bit awkward or a little bit surprising to people. And that association that happens in the brain has to happen very quickly in order for it to be funny. So there is actually a correlation.
And we'll move on to the last of our pre-submitted questions. So that's really the cue for everybody in the chat across all platforms to please start banging away furiously at the keyboard, because we will be getting to your questions, at least the first few. So Chudney would like to know, what's your favorite retrospective format? Or is that like asking you to pick a favorite child?
Well, I have 3 children, so I'm not gonna answer that. But I actually have a favorite retrospective, and I'm gonna try and share my screen here. I don't know if it's working. Is it working?
I can see it, yes.
Yeah. So my very favorite retrospective activity is just the basic timeline activity. And the reason why I really like the timeline activity as a retrospective is because it's very easy to explain to people what you do, and it's very easy to read it, to get some information out of the timeline. So the timeline retrospective in this case is that I put the vertical axis is the low energy at the bottom and the high energy at the top. And then what I want people to do is to write some things and then put it either in the high energy or the low energy, and either put it here in November or in March. And then people can put +1 stickies on them if they agree on it, and then we can group them, and then we can come up with some action points afterwards. And one of the reasons why I really like that, as I said, is because it's easy to work with. One of the things that's really difficult as a facilitator is to explain the activity so that people actually make use of the activity in the right way. So they might start writing on the wrong post-it notes, so they might writing the wrong things or something like that. So making some examples is also really important when you show a new activity. So when I use this activity, I normally just, as I did before, I take one of these post-it notes in and I write a little bit on the post-it note and then show them that I can move it around. Now, I have actually a website here, how to facilitate distributed retrospectives, where I have a lot of links to different templates of retrospectives. Now they're in Google Drawing, and I know some people don't like to use Google tools, but you can look at what has been made, for instance, the 6 thinking hats here, or the retrospective template with the 4 posters here. And then if you don't want to use the Google drawings, you can just do it in Mural or Miro or whatever you want, and you can just copy it and make however many you want. But another thing that you can do also is that you can use this Nitro.io, which is something that will help you facilitate the retrospectives online, where you don't have to create all the documents yourself. So you can just start a session in here. And the same for Retroom, where you start a different session for retrospectives online. And it's easier for the facilitator because they don't have to prepare the document. They don't have to go through everything and remember what is the next step, because the tool will help you understand what the next step is. So that was sort of a little bit about my favorite retrospective, but also the things that you can do if you don't want to create all these documents yourself.
Great, thanks for the run through there. That's some handy tools that I haven't seen before. We tend to use Miro, which works reasonably well for our needs in the team, but never hurts to try a few more. You did mention your blog there about distributed teams, and you had the picture of the famous BBC reporter talking very seriously about Korea, and his kid runs in. This was pre-COVID, so it of course got way more attention and opinions that, you know, we might even laugh at a little bit today given where we are. But as I said, in preparation for this event, I watched your talk from YOW conference in 2019, which I think was around December or November. And watching it, it seemed really prophetic, because you did talk about running distributed retrospectives, and you had some advice around that, which I think we've all been implementing this year more out of necessity than will. Do you have anything more to add, given that we've, as a collective world, grown so much in the last year and a half or so?
Well, I think that the one thing that you have to remember when you are to facilitate a retrospective that's online is that you have to really prepare a lot more than when it's in real life. In real life, you just walk in the room with your pens and your post-it notes, and maybe you have an agenda, but you can just write something else and put some extra post-it notes, and suddenly it's a whole new activity. But with an online retrospective, you have to actually plan what you want to do, and it's more difficult to change it just while you're facilitating the retrospective. So there's a lot more thinking about that. But there's also the guidelines I have for myself is when I have to facilitate an online retrospective, I send an email the day before with the link to the online tool that I want to use to make sure that they can actually access it, because I don't want them to spend the first 3 to 5 minutes trying to figure out how to access it when the meeting starts, because when it's online, you don't have as much time. So losing 5 minutes is actually a very big percentage of the meeting. So reminding them 15 minutes before the retrospective, now go out and get some coffee or get some water and go to the toilet, because you can't really concentrate if you're thirsty or need to go to the toilet. And it's really important in a retrospective that people can concentrate on what's happening, to actually listen to what the team members are saying or read what the team members are writing and think about how to move on. And then I think another thing is to try to make everybody share their video. I know that some people find it difficult to watch themselves on video, but normally they can hide their self-view so they don't have to look at themselves. There could also be some psychological reasons that they don't want to be on video, and of course that should be respected. But otherwise, as a facilitator, your main tool is actually to listen and to look at people, to follow their body language, to see whether they're angry or whether they think somebody's stupid or whether they have a question they want to ask or something like that. And if you deprive the facilitator of even that small form of body language, it's really difficult to facilitate a retrospective. So try to push for having the video on everybody, and actually also don't mute people. Let everybody be unmuted all the time, because now that we've had this COVID for so long, everybody's sound systems, or mostly everyone's sound systems, are actually pretty good. So I like hearing people sip their coffee or lose their pencil or laugh a little bit of what's been said. And it gives it a more humane context instead of having just talking. When someone is talking, it's completely silent. That's a bit weird, I think. So just having everybody unmute, I think, is very nice.
We had an interesting one this morning in our stand-up. One of the people in the stand-up was in another office with someone else. So he had a mask on, but then he was muted. And then we're like, hey, is someone else supposed to talk? Turned out he was talking, but he had his mask on as well, and we couldn't figure out what was happening. So that was a little taste of the times that made me chuckle a little bit.
Yeah, definitely different.
So there's another question through the chat, which is great. Please keep them coming. We've got about 20 minutes left, so it's absolutely not too late. Anders would like to know, could you please share with us your worst experience with retrospectives, and of course the best one? So highlight, lowlight.
Yeah, so the worst experience with the retrospectives is the one that's been stuck in me for 15 years. And I can't really get over it. And that's the one that I'm always talking about. I think I said it also in Australia for that talk that you watched. It was in the beginning of my retrospective facilitation journey, and I was facilitating a group of men. It probably isn't necessary to say it was men, but it was men. It was very serious, very adult developers, and I tried to create a retrospective which was very serious and not so much fun and games. But they were focusing very much on the negative things. So they didn't really celebrate the good things. There weren't many good things coming up when we gathered data. And it was more like complaining about things, and they weren't really interested in solving any problems, more just complaining. And I thought in the end, I need to get the mood up a bit. I need to sort of do something positive for these people. So I just read about the appreciation scheme. I think it was in Norm Kurth's book, where you make people appreciate each other. So I asked them to stand in a circle. There was already a little bit of a buzzkill for them to stand in a circle. That's a little bit too hippie, but they did. And they were standing in a circle, and then I had a little ball, and I said, well, so this little ball, I'll throw it to somebody and say an appreciation, and then that person should say an appreciation to somebody else and throw that ball. So I chose one of them in the group, and I threw the ball at him, and he caught the ball. And I said, so now it's your turn to appreciate somebody, give them a compliment, or say thank you. It could be just a little thing, and then throw it to somebody else. And he looked at the ball, and he looked around at everybody else, and then he just dropped the ball on the floor, and it was just dead silence. And I just felt, this was really the worst thing I could have done. I need to stop. I need to end this retrospective quickly. So I ended it really quickly and wrapped it all up and said, okay, that was it for the retrospective, and now we move on. And that felt really bad, because it really made me feel like a lousy facilitator for not being able to help them appreciate each other. On the other hand, one of the best things that I ever experienced was at an IT company, I think in Denmark, where there was a new person on the team, a front-end developer, and he had been really quiet in the start of the retrospective. And then when we started generating insights about some problems with the front end, he came up with saying that he really felt sorry about what happened. And then people sort of turned to him and said, "What do you mean? Why do you feel sorry?" And he said that it's all his fault. He screwed it up. He didn't know what to do. It just became terrible, and it was all his fault. And then they all just turned to him and said, "No, it's not your fault. It's wonderful that that you worked on this front end, and we know that it's very, very difficult to understand this system. So of course, when you're new, there's a lot of things you don't understand, and of course you do things." But the things that you do also shows us the vulnerabilities in our system, and the vulnerabilities in our architecture, and the vulnerability in how we actually onboard people in this team. So the things that you've done, we shouldn't look at them as failures. We should look at them as learning experiences, because the next time we onboard somebody, we're much better prepared. So actually what you've done is doing us a huge favor. And he was so happy after that. He just said, "Oh, really, thank you." And he was so happy. So that was one of my best experiences in a retrospective. And if we run out of questions, I've got a lot of questions myself I can ask, so not a problem at all.
Thanks. That story there that you just told about the new front-end developer, I'm seeing a lot of similarities with my own story and the team that I'm in. I work on a very large, older project. And the learning curve for me has just been so steep, and sometimes the imposter syndrome is super, super high. So that environment that you explain of looking at it not as failure, but as learning opportunities, and maybe a way to make the documentation or onboarding better, that's really, really important. And at least in my experience, it's the thing that's really helped me to open up in the retrospectives and not being afraid of speaking my mind, and having that full psychological safety, especially in these COVID times where we might be feeling a little depressed or a little bit down. Just to be able to say that to your team in your retro, that you had a bad week, is actually really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm really, really happy that you shared that. And those teams do exist. So if you're in the ball drop team, I mean, I feel really sorry for you. And I'm glad I'm in the other team. So we have one more question that's come in through the Airtable forms, which is, what advice would you give your younger self?
That's a big question. I'm guessing it's in relation to retrospectives, right?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, let's go freeform. I mean, you're not just one dimension, right?
No. Oh, what advice would I give my younger self? So many things I would say to myself. But I think that first and foremost, I would remind myself of the prime directive. No matter what happens, no matter how terrible you think you've done this, or how stupid you've been, and I've been stupid so many times, remember that you did the best you could at the time with what you knew, and what the energy you had and the skill set you had. You definitely did the best you could, and you couldn't have done any better, because what's the alternative? The alternative is I show up at work and I decide not to do my best. No, nobody really does that. I mean, I guess there are a few who does that, but I don't think it's the majority. I think most people actually try to do the best they can at work, and that definitely holds for yourself. So that's probably the thing that I would say to my younger self. Be more forgiving with yourself. Don't beat yourself up, and try to learn from the mistakes. And that's also what I've done with the retrospective. So every time I have a retrospective, I write down the agenda that I want to have, and I write down anything that happens that I could learn from in the retrospective. Okay, so this didn't go well, or this went well. So that I sometimes scroll through these books on retrospectives that I've facilitated, and then I learned from that. And that's actually how my book came about, because I looked through all my retrospective notebooks, and then I wrote a book about all the things that had gone wrong for me, and how I solved all the problems that I'd been in. And sometimes I didn't solve them when I was in them, but the next time I had a retrospective or the year after, I learned how to do that.
So we have a question from Therese in the Facebook chat, and I think you might be able to see it there. You said you ended, when you told your worst scenario story, you said you ended maybe a little bit abruptly. So when you had the ball drop guy, that's his name now, what do you wish you had done instead of maybe wrapping up the retro as quick as you did? Or do you stand by your decision?
I don't stand by my decision. And thank you, Teresa, for asking that question. I can always count on you. So what I would have done now with the ball drop guy, this has some weird connotations, but anyway, we'll call him that. I would have seen it as a gift, because all sorts of information that you get in the team are gifts, because they allow you to understand what's going on inside people's heads. So with teaching as well as with facilitation, it's really difficult to figure out what people are thinking and what they believe, because it's like black box testing. You can only see what they're saying or what they're doing. So when they're doing something like this, which is a huge thing, it's a huge piece of data that you get. And I would have probably picked up the ball, and I would have thrown the ball to somebody else. Or maybe I would have asked, is there somebody else who can appreciate somebody else in the team? And if nobody had taken up that ball, if nobody wanted to say anything nice in that team, I would probably still have ended the retrospective there and then I would have said to whoever needed to know, the team leader or something like that, there's something hugely interesting going on in that team. It could be either that they don't want to say anything appreciative to each other, that they don't feel there's anything appreciative to say. It could also be that the ball drop guy had such a high star in the team that everybody looked up to him, that when he showed what to do, nobody else wanted to do anything differently than that. And that's a problem sometimes at retrospectives. If somebody who's got a high status in the crowd does something like making fun of an activity or refuses to make post-it notes, then it can spread to other people. And that's something that you have to deal with outside the retrospective, because putting a finger on one person in a retrospective almost always backfires. They'll react very negatively to that, or not at all. So I would have taken it as a very interesting data point to take with me on my journey with that team. Now, I was never invited to facilitate a retrospective for that team again, so I couldn't.
The crazy lady with her ball.
Yeah, exactly. That one crazy lady. I can say there's also any icebreaker activity you recommend.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, there's a lot of icebreaker activities that I like. The problem with retrospectives is that they're often fairly short, so it can be difficult to do something really fun. One of my favorite ones is that everybody gets a piece of paper and walks around in the room and asks somebody else to draw their eyes or their nose or their mouth, which is funny. And it's also something where you get to look at each other and appreciate each other. And then in the end, after a few hours, you look at the pictures and then you try to guess who it is on the pictures. And they're often remarkably good. I mean, based on the fact that most people stop drawing when they're 3 to 5 years old. So it looks like kids' drawings, but it's still often funny to that you can recognize people. But that's something that you can't really do in the beginning of a retrospective. That's 1.5 hours or 1 hour and 15 minutes. So what I do instead is that I either put them on a quest, like I say, for the next retrospective, you should find a thing that means something to you and show it to other people, or you should find a thing that nobody knows what is and then show it to other people and make them guess what it is. So I could, for instance, take this. What is this, Adele? Can you guess what this is?
A Chinese finger trap.
No, I don't know what a Chinese finger trap is, but it's just something that I'm playing with when I have meetings. Is that a Chinese finger trap?
No, you put your fingers in it and then you can't get them out.
No, it's just a toy.
Oh, all right. I mean, a finger trap's a toy to some people, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, masochistic people. So that's one thing and that also, if you have an icebreaker where people are showing something on the video, then they start the video. So it can be sort of a subtle way of asking people to start the video. Other things that I do now in order to start the retrospective is to ask them a question. And some of my favorite ones are, can you describe the last sprint as a weather forecast? Or what did you take too seriously in the last sprint? Or what did you not take seriously enough in the last sprint? Or what was the first thing you bought with your own money? Or if you could get a skill tomorrow, what would that be? Or anything like that. And I think these things are great because it makes people open up and say a little bit more about their personality, which is part of building the trust that we talked about previously. So sharing a little bit and sharing something that which might be a little bit silly also means that if you have been silly already, then it's not that painful to be a little bit silly or maybe feel a little bit stupid later when you have to say there's something you don't understand. And also these icebreaker things that I do in the beginning of the retrospectives also means that everybody says something, and then it's easier for them to say something afterwards. So if they're allowed to be quiet in the beginning, it's much easier for them to stay quiet. And also normally when you go from meeting to meeting like we do now, there's often this brain residue in the brain from the last meeting, and you need to get rid of that. And you can get rid of that by laughing. And so if you can have some laughing there, then it's a very good start of it.
So we have 5 minutes left. So I think without any more questions coming in, I'm going to wrap up with a question. Again, women in tech, power to the sisterhood. I was struck by your story earlier where you said that you kind of fell into program because you were almost going to fail, but someone sort of took you by the hand in the basement and showed you how to do it. And then you just realized that you loved it. I fear that there's a lot of girls in the world that could have had that experience, but just don't because they just didn't have the fortune or everything lining up to have that experience. What would you like to see happen to encourage more girls into tech and to make it a clearer path for girls?
I think that we need to, I think we need to look at software development and IT already in the primary and the secondary school. I had this discussion with the parents from my children's classes. So when my children were about 10, the two youngest one, they were different years when they were 10, I proposed to have a programming session with Scratch programming with some of the children. And then we also talked about how the internet works and how security works. So some of the parents actually also showed up to hear that part of it and start programming. And then some of the parents said, oh, why do they need to become nerds that just sit behind a screen? And I'm like me? Thank you. And the funny thing was that one of the people who said it, he's a biologist. And I'm like, why do they need to learn about biology? In a sense, they need to learn about biology and physics and chemistry because that's what's in the world around them. But you cannot say that IT is not in the world around the children right now. They need to learn about security. They need to learn about the internet. They need to know about data. They need to know about programming, I think. Otherwise, they'll become illiterate. And I think if you start with these things before it becomes uncool for people to be programmers, then you can get more women into the programming.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I find that one about turning into nerds behind a screen. I mean, pretty much everyone's knowledge profession requires them behind a screen. I'd much rather be behind an IDE than a PowerPoint, or a really complicated Excel spreadsheet or workbook that makes no sense. Whether you're a programmer or not, you're going to spend a lot of your workday behind a computer screen. So why not understand what it's doing and make it do the thing that you want it to do?
Yeah.
So let's leave it there. We are perfectly on time. Look at us go. So I do just have a couple of points to wrap up with. So first of all, a couple of Twitter handles you might like to follow. There's @GoToCon to stay up to date with the GoTo conferences, including GoTo Amsterdam. There's also GoTo Academy NL, which is to stay up to date with GoTo Academy here in the Netherlands, which is where Aino's next engagement is with us here at GoTo on June 15th. So yes, if you do want to hear more from Aino, the next date with respect to GoTo is June 15. It is virtual, as a lot of our lives these days, so you don't have to be in Amsterdam. If you're really brave, you could even be in Australia and do it on night shift. And it will allow you to go into a deeper dive of the themes we have discussed today. And of course, the GoTo Amsterdam conference, still on track for an IRL event, December 6th to 9th. Aino, I believe, is speaking, but with the exact dates and logistics still being worked out. And one final plug for Twitter is Aino's Twitter, which I find your handle a little strange. Can you explain it maybe? It's at APAIPI. Is there a story behind that one?
Yeah.
Would you share it or not?
No, I shared. So it was in the first programming class at university in 1991. It's not that long ago. We were to implement an algorithm which would turn every sentence into PP language. And the algorithm was made for Danish words. So it would take every syllable and then it would copy the syllable with a P in front. So it would be hi pi, my pi, name pim, is pis, I pi, mopo. Your poor ne pay me per is pis a pa de per lepe, right? So we implemented this algorithm, but the trouble is that my name is not Danish, it's Finnish. So the algorithm would cut my name into would not cut my name into two syllables. My name should be Aino, but because it would cut it into three syllables instead. So Aino. So it would be Apa Ipi Nopo, and that became my Indian name at computer science, which means the lady who shakes when she laughs. And that became my first email address, apaipi@cs.au.dk. And then, of course, apaipi became my Twitter handle, because apaipi is me, the woman who laughs and shakes.
And why not hold on to something with that story? So just before we sign off, I would like to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to share? I believe you have a book. There it is, Retrospective Anti-Patterns.
Yeah, with the little, with Scarlet, the red octopus.
Great. I actually don't really like octopus. They just freak me out. Something about them grabbing my face. No, thank you.
Sorry, I really love octopuses. Then I shouldn't show you.
Oh, no, no.
Sorry.
Well, you're entitled to your wrong opinion about octopus. But on that note, that very highbrow note, let's leave it there for today. Thank you so much, Aino, for your time today. I've certainly learned a lot. And, of course, always great to know another expert within software engineering. So thank you so much again for your time today. And I've already given all the promos I need to. So for now,